to Joan Burton.
Thank you. I think this bill is what you would describe as virtue signalling. In other words, the Minister for Finance, Department of Finance, want to send out a message that times have changed. We really hope not to go back to the period of the bank guarantee, when, in fact, all of the parties in the House, with the exception of the Labour Party, actually voted for the bank guarantee. It was probably one of the biggest mistakes that was ever made in the country's history. But we want to say now that with a fund, $2 billion up front and then £500 million a year, that in fact our economy is more structurally sound than it might otherwise appear to be. Now, as a strategic tactic, I can understand why the Minister for Finance might want to send out virtue signals. But I find it very difficult that a Minister for Finance who presided over a budget, an actual budget day, which bore almost no comparison to what he brought to this House as his forecast and outline of his budgetary position at the time of the summer economic statements and other statements. I actually don't know how the Minister for Finance can attempt to lecture anyone, and how, as we all know, he suddenly found, miraculously, was it a similar £500 million down the back of the sofa to give to the Department of Health in the actual budget? And he also discovered, as we know, in recent times, that the overrun on the children's hospital costs, a much-needed project in this country, is of a scale that the country has never actually experienced before. And does the Minister for Finance, do the economic managers in this government, can they come forward and give us an explanation, or, if you like, an account of their management as to how so much money has gone astray in just one area? They've been completely silent. They are now saying to us that this particular bill is actually part of the fix in terms of economic difficulties we may face in the future. I actually don't believe that, and I know that some of the people in government and some of the people in the Department of Finance are probably far too intelligent to believe it themselves either. As I say, strategically, virtue signalling in terms of saying that a country is potentially more robust than it might otherwise be may have its values. But bear in mind that as a country, we now have, when you take into account our gross debt minus the other holdings that we have, it's probably somewhere below 60%. That's the real situation. That is the EU target. And so it may not be recognised, or it may not be presented like that, but that is actually what the figures show. And it would be far better if we had a real conversation about where we really stand, because, in my view, we are now entering the scariest, riskiest points in our country's financial history as we approach the UK's decision on Brexit. I see this evening, for instance, that the first motion in the House of Commons in relation to effectively a customs union put forward by the British Labour Party, that has been defeated by 327 votes against to 296 for. I obviously don't know at this point what the fate of the other votes, which I think are taking place later on tonight. But, you know, the Minister's own commentary today confirms that we are at a very dangerous point. The Minister has indicated, and the Taoiseach has indicated, that two significant standout risks are that overall a difficult Brexit will lower growth by something like 4 points, and that, in fact, we can anticipate an increase in unemployment, again, of 2 points over a period of time. Now, these are not minor indicators. These are really serious indicators. All those people who are now back at work, a proportion of them face a serious risk of facing into unemployment and all the distress and the hardship for families, individuals, towns and the whole country we may experience again. We've the largest clouds hanging over the economy since the bank guarantee and NAMA and the collapse of the banks and the working out of that. And I was a part of the government that had to take up the reins of a mess when Fianna Fáil walked off the pitch, left government buildings practically in darkness, and we had to pick up the pieces. And, you know, on many occasions, particularly after 2013, year after year, as Minister for Social Protection, I had to see money from the savings made in social protection by getting people back to work go to the Department of Health to try and stabilise their position. And instead of the Department of Health now being managed by the government, which is challenging, the figures coming out of health are now worse than they've ever been. And for many people, unfortunately, the experience of the health service is nothing like it ought to be in a country as rich as this country. And not only that, but we are now facing a really difficult, dangerous strike by nurses who are looking to have their legitimate pay issues addressed in a competent manner by this government, which should be responsible for managing economic events. So instead, we're going to have a buffer in place of €2 billion from the Strategic Investment Fund, followed by £500 million a year. As has been said by a lot of other speakers, we have absolutely no idea at what point it may be used, except that all the indications are it's there as a kind of backstop to limit the impact of another financial, banking, fiscal crisis. And that's part of a European framework. But I would say to the Minister that there are certain issues which are giving rise to populism and danger to European democracies right across Europe. And in this country, we have an acute housing crisis that is upending all the previous assumptions among young people who've got jobs, employment and education, that they can be able to afford to rent accommodation at a reasonable cost, say at less than 25% of their income. A lot of countries would say 15% of their income, and who should be able to aspire, as their parents and grandparents were able to aspire to eventually purchase their own home or build their own home. Now, we have allowed that particular expectation and assumption to be upended. So when the Minister, I recall in his last budget, quoting from Yeats about the centre must hold, as opposed to the centre cannot hold, on housing, the Minister should know that the centre is not holding. And you then have the distress for so many citizens of being aware that we have so many people who are homeless, and that instead of that problem being tackled, that problem is actually getting worse. So how do you undermine an economy? How do you undermine a democracy? You do that by enormous catastrophic events like the bank guarantee and what happened after it. But you also undermine it if you consistently undermine people's reasonable expectations of what, with education and hard work and diligence and applications, they believe they should be reasonably entitled to experience. Rent at a reasonable price and access at an appropriate time to being able to have either a very secure long-term tenancy or to be able to purchase or build a house. So I would say to the Minister, if he is seeking, in fact, to shore up the Irish economy and to build people's confidence in this country that we can come through what may be a very difficult time with Brexit. And I have to say it's an event that I don't think anybody in any part of this House, other than perhaps the people from Solidarity, People Before Profit, they have said their legs are tears. They're in favour of a left-wing exit of some kind out of the European Union. I'm not aware that other people support Ireland quitting the European Union. So what we have now is a situation where we're debating this very modest bill to virtue signal in respect of, as I said, 8 billion ultimately over a number of years. I think we'd be far better in terms of economic strategy in utilising the funds that we have available in a careful way, because we have to be careful with money, to actually address the key crisis that could undermine our very democracy in this country. And we also have not really had a discussion, because we can't have it yet because we don't know the outcome, of how exactly we're going to respond to Brexit. But what we were told by the Taoiseach today is that we're actually not going to see the actual details of the Brexit legislation until sometime towards the end of February. And I think the assumption is that that has to be passed probably before the 25th of March. I just think if ever there was a time when a government has managed to put a whole load of carts before the horse, this example on this bill is one, because really, if we have a very difficult Brexit, we will need to be able to have a command of our financial resources and to manage our debt situation in a way that we can best maintain all of the features of Irish government expenditure that we wish to see maintained. That includes current expenditure in terms of all the necessary areas, education, health, social welfare. We know what happened when the economy went into crisis. I can remember that report called On Board Schnip of all the things that were to be cut and eliminated. And I mean, remember, once countries have signed up to these events, it's not possible to call them back. And I just find at this particular point the idea that the government would spend time on this legislation genuinely extraordinary. The government should be putting its best brains, its brightest brains, to actually addressing those significant issues that we have, particularly in the area of capital investment in housing, particularly in the necessary investment that we require in education. And we also need to take into account that there are expectations, to put it mildly, in terms of what is going to happen broadly on tax policy and tax structure in Europe. We know already that quite a number of European countries are moving to a digital taxation in relation particularly to the very big IT and social media companies, because they're getting and generating no tax revenue from all of the spending that their citizens are making in those areas. I think it's perfectly understandable that this is happening. And yet the Minister went to Davos, and even in the clear, cool air of Davos, he couldn't actually acknowledge that Ireland has a problem in relation to how it deals with corporation tax and how it's not sustainable in the long term, that social media type companies and other companies would contribute so little in terms of a fair share of corporate taxation to the different countries that they operate in. Now, I just find that what is happening is just flying in the face of what's happening tonight in the UK Parliament, where we are moving potentially close to a very difficult Brexit, if not a disastrous Brexit. And we all know as well, in the context of the Belfast Agreement, I think there's probably pretty much unanimity that we do not want a hard border in Ireland. But I actually don't think this bill is going to do anything to help any of that. I know, the government is probably doing this on foot of Fianna Fáil's original plans around this legislation. But that was to basically get Fianna Fáil in a position where it could begin to restore its reputation for fiscal rectitude, having wrecked the economy through the bank guarantee. So, I believe that the government's decision to go with this bill, it's not appropriate at this time. I don't think it will lead to a good use of funds on behalf of the people of Ireland. I think the housing situation and the housing crisis and the need to invest in that is pretty much the elemental crisis that this government is facing and is failing to manage. As I said, I think the overruns on the Children's Hospital, which amount at this point to several multiples of potential annual transfers to the fund. The government seems incapable of being able to manage that. One of the first decisions the government did make was to abolish the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. I don't think it was very loved by very many people, but it was an oversight body which was meant to actually look at and query the spending of funds by different government agencies and departments. We're now back to the good old days. It's rolled into finance. So, in fact, it's very difficult even now to ask the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform and Finance for a specific answer on a question around what's been happening to the Children's Hospital and the massive budget overrun, because he just passes that off now as the Minister for Finance to the Department of Health. And they, months later, send a blah-de-blah reply with no actual detail of the information that, if there was proper accountability, they should be able to identify and answer for. So, I think it's just regrettable that the government should decide to roll along with this at this point in time. I think we would be far better served by having a detailed discussion of the impact on businesses, the likely impact on businesses of a difficult Brexit. And if you think of, say, a couple of people who are running a small business on their own, where they're importing and exporting to and from the UK, they're going to have to meet the costs, for instance, of customs clearance and so on, if there is a hard Brexit. We know that in the UK, in terms of our imports of food from the UK, that there's likely to be what hasn't been seen in the Irish economy now for 10 years, which is significant increases in inflation. We're doing that against a backdrop where we see, in relation to the nurses' strike, the proposal that the government really is unprepared to actually discuss and establish a pay discussion forum for public service employees. I mean, public servants took a lot of cuts and experienced a lot of difficulties. There has been a process of restoration, but in fact there's lots of people who haven't actually got much, if anything, in a way of increase. So we're really facing some very difficult times, and I just think that this particular bill is a distraction, and as I said, it's virtue signalling, I suppose, in the hope that somebody in Bloomberg or someplace like that will pick it up and say, oh, this is very good. Ireland is putting away a few bob for the rainy day. Well, you know what they say about bankers on a rainy day? They say, when it's a rainy day, the bankers will take the umbrellas away, but of course when the sun is shining, that bankers will be out with the umbrellas. And to be honest, this is the kind of rather strange economic, if you like, interlude, but in fact it really is a distraction from the real issues that face us, the difficulties around Brexit, that we should be here tonight discussing this.